So this is the big pitch, right? There are all these problems in the transport system. We are going to invent these new technologies that will solve it.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the BetaKit podcast. I am Douglas Saltis, editor-in-chief of BetaKit, and along with my co-host, Rob Kennedy, this week we are going to solve the future of transportation. Rob,
over to you.
How about you go first? Yeah. No, why are we talking about transportation and particularly innovation in transportation along a clean tech lens, electric vehicles, EVs? Why is that a topic of conversation this week on the podcast?
Well, I think a few reasons. I mean, looking in reverse order from starting with this week, the Biden administration basically threatened that by about 10 or so years from now, 2/3 of all cars that are being produced or being purchasable in the United States have to be electric.
Yeah, I think it's at least half of new vehicle sales to be fully electric or plug-in hybrids by 2030, and significantly more within a 10-year window.
So that affects us.
It affects us greatly, given the fact that tons of our manufacturing is directly tied into the U.S. market. As most people know, there's huge hybrid overlap of manufacturing in Ontario connected to the rest of the United States. You might have remembered there was this guy named Donald Trump, and he made a lot of threats and demands a couple of years ago, all over the place, but specifically related to trade deals and auto parts manufacturing. But it's not just that new announcement coming through the U.S.
We were prescient, is what you're trying to say.
It's not just that announcement coming this week from the EPA. It's also, in Budget 2023, you've seen our government announce all sorts of clean tech commitments, tax credits on use and manufacturing, mostly in response to, again, the U.S. government's Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, great name for it, which is a massive, massive bill with far-ranging implications. I think almost $370 billion in incentives to push forward a cleaner, greener future. And a lot of that involves investment and, I would say, scaling and rolling out clean tech innovation. So we found ourselves at this moment wondering, well, what any of this fucking means, because we're not... I don't think we're experts in many things, but certainly not auto manufacturing or clean technologies. So we decided to bring together a couple guests on the podcast this week to share their perspective on this and honestly let them do the heavy lifting for us. So Rob, I think we should start with you because we split the party on this. We did separate interviews. You spoke to one, Flavio Volpe, who is the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. He's been all over the media since January. Why did you tell us why Flavio has been in the news?
Well, at CES this year, which always happens right after Christmas, right after the New Year's, they launched a car, or at least a prototype vehicle, that basically was a culmination of 58 industry partners, and they launched it at CES.
The Consumer Electronics Showcase.
The Consumer Electronics Show in Vegas, which is not a common place for us to be launching stuff. It's more of it used to be, a lot about like hardware and stuff, and then it became a lot about apps. And I'd say in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, since autonomous driving has become a thing, it's become as much a car show as it's become an electronics show. And so the idea was to show that Canada has all the constituent components, manufacturers and design and capability to build a car, an electric car, from top to bottom. And that was the point of the grand unveiling in January.
Yeah, of Project Arrow, which carries forward specific connotations for Canadian historians or people who just grew up in the 90s watching Canadian Heritage Moments. The last great innovative piece of transportation technology designed by Canadians, except maybe, I don't know, like you could talk about Cannon Arms and things like that. I don't know. Watch the Canadian Heritage Moment. But this was being led by the APMA, the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, of which Flavio is the president. And you said, they rolled out this prototype. There's been a lot of conversation in the media about, oh, hey, Canada just manufactured its own EV, the first ever. Look at us. But in your conversation with Flavio, it's a little bit different than that. This is a different type of, this isn't exactly a concept car, and it's not something that's going to be showing up on show floors anytime soon. So where does this kind of fit in the middle?
Flavio was basically showing that we had the capacity to build a car from soup to nuts, and rather than mass producing it ourselves, a la finding an Elon Musk to sort of take over a car company and then build a brand around it, I think the idea here was to show that we could do anything that any manufacturer wanted in the world and can build and design an entire car or parts of an entire car. So the idea here was to prove that we can do it, because it wasn't necessarily clear that we have the complete capacity. But the idea was never maybe to build one of those cars to show that the thing can actually roll. But the idea wasn't for you or I to be able to buy it. And he definitely wanted to take back, I asked him about it, he definitely wanted to take back the Aero term or name and sort of bring it into good standing. And definitely it caught a lot of eyeballs, I think, for those, nerds who pay attention to this stuff and are old enough to know what the connotations are.
Yeah, now they have received some government support from this at a bunch of different levels, which I think is a component where we get interested. But you're all right. This, we talk a lot about the failures of Canada to be, inventive but not innovative. To roughly paraphrase Dan Bresnitz, who was on the podcast recently, like we can't really turn our work into IP or productions that benefit and come back to Canada. This is really interesting because it's not quite that either. Because in as you were saying, in some ways, it's almost like the best proof of concept sales job. It's like, listen, we've got all the materials for all the components. We can manufacture all the parts here. We're doing it. And then we can assemble any vehicle you need. So global automakers, should you want to come build EVs in North America, because it looks like that's going to be a top priority for several governments around the world, specifically in North America, boy, howdy, there are some parts of Ontario that are ready for you. Was that kind of your takeaway from this?
Yeah, and also I'd be interested to get your take on this as a covering the innovation ecosystem. But just to respond directly to your question, the other interesting thing is we've spent a lot of time talking about the minerals and components that Canada has. So we're not just able to monetize the things that we stand on in a very raw materials way, but we can actually they're malleable, and we know how to bend them into something that is actually saleable, active and saleable.
Yeah, there's another natural resource that we can extract that happens to be in Canada, right? Which is, jokes aside, a very big deal for a variety of considerations, because there's been some concern that all the batteries that we rely on we're going to be a bit of a problem. Like, battery tech requires not just a software patch; it requires hard components to do this, and logistical process to bring it not only out of the ground but to market, right?
And Flavio mentioned that, and this has come up a bunch of times on this show, where it's like, where do we have the capacity to, as a country, to build stuff? I mean, he pointed out that the parts manufacturers pivoted for the pandemic to make ventilators and that kind of equipment. So I'm curious to hear about your take on it, because we often are talking on this show about the need to create an innovation ecosystem and stop relying on the things that we stand on and being a natural resource-based economy. But here's an example of innovation, physical innovation. How did that sit with you compared to the stuff that BetaKit typically talks about? It's usually brain stuff, not physical stuff.
Yeah, we do a lot of B2B SaaS on BetaKit.
Yeah,
we talk about that a lot here. Obviously it's just a little bit more novel than that. But again, Canada has a long history of, I made a Canadarm joke, but there's some other low Earth orbit stuff that we had. We had Felix and Paul on talking about sending really cool AR and VR tech to the International Space Station. I think it's a couple of things. First, beyond the initial wait, Canada's funding an electric vehicle. How's that going to work? And then it's like, oh, they're not. They're funding this thing, which is kind of like, oh, this is a very interesting approach. This is actually within a limited capacity, a very smartly conceived way to showcase and sell through, hey, a bunch of automotive parts manufacturers that this person might be the association president of, right? But then also, again, demonstrating that maybe there's greater potential here. And then I think, we're doing this podcast. I think Tesla's going to come up a bit. We're going to try to leave the South African who spent some time living in Canada out of this conversation as much as possible, just because I'm just sick of his shit. But by point of comparison, you're like, well, this is very Canadian. It's forward-thinking, conservative in approach, and scoped just right from a budget perspective to drive more global interest in Canadian resources and Canadian manufacturing talent. And I don't mean that as a dig. I just think it's very aligned towards what we do very well. What it is not is the Tesla approach of screw it. We're going to build a car. We're going to do the incredibly hard thing and become a new car manufacturer. We're going to sell these things. We're going to take leadership in the market. We're going to take a share of the market from the major manufacturers. So in
the
one
thing
sense,
Americans do well.
well, we're South Africans, spent some time living in Canada, things like that, which no shade, is an incredibly hard thing to do anywhere in the world, right? There was some announcements in the news that we'll link to recently where like Canada the federal government was very happy that we've just announced some manufacturing deals with European auto manufacturers here that have had a really poor historical record when it comes to environmental issues. But hey, that's going to bring long-term commitments in manufacturing, jobs, all those things. I'm 100% here for that. And I do think this is a great proof case towards what can be done when a bunch of Canadians rub their hands together and say, what can we get together? Like, the Canadian Shield is going to come up in conversation. We've obviously had them on the podcast a couple times. I think we also remember what happened to the Canadian Shield when they kind of stepped up and tried to fill gaps that they were maybe not in full control of being able to fill when it came to personal protective equipment and things like that. But I think this conversation with Flavio is very interesting, and we're going to get to it in just 1 second. But before that, I want to introduce our other guests on the back end. One, Paris Marx, who is a Canadian tech critic, author of the book Road to Nowhere, which is essentially why big tech transit projects have not worked out, because they're basically getting the future of transportation wrong. You might wonder why we've paired these two conversations together. I think at a time in which we have this new innovative showcase of Canada being able to do the soup to nuts natural resource auto manufacturing thing, it's worthwhile to have a conversation as to whether or not the future of transportation is electric vehicles, because that seems to be where the government and corporate incentives are leading towards. Maybe the social political, it seems to be a hot button issue, but everyone seems to be looking to move our traditional industries to produce similar things with new technology to reduce emissions. That's a prompt maybe to have a conversation about whether or not that's the right approach and what a more ideal approach would be. I really enjoyed this conversation with Paris. I'll let everyone know we went way over the time budget I was allotted for the interview, and our producer Katie, hi producer Katie, took a hatchet job to many of the interesting things that Paris said. So we're hoping to have them back maybe on a future podcast, because a lot of it was very interesting, not super relevant. Stay tuned. But I think the thing that stood out for me in this component, and I want to gauge your reaction on if you were feeling the same way, is there seemed to just be that standard criticism that we've seen before, that we've honestly forwarded on this podcast for years, as to whether or not large-scale problems can be fundamentally solved just by putting new technologies in there. But there was something else that Paris brought up. It's like, are we truly investigating whether or not electric vehicles are going to deliver the environmental benefit that we're expecting from this transition? And that really resonated. I think maybe because everyone's looking for a little bit of hope in 2023, and it's cool to see at least some gears turning towards systemic change. And then you've got someone like Paris raising their hand and being like, well, actually, that's a dumb system in the first place. So what was your take on this? Because in the moment I was pretty captivated by it and wanted to keep teasing out the implications. But how did that honestly mix with you after speaking with Flavio, who was so charismatic and forthright about what Canada is producing now and what it could be producing down the road.
I mean, you're right. You forget sometimes, you're like, he's in some senses, his job is to promote that stuff, but he obviously believes in it. And without thinking through too carefully, you're like, well, of course, yeah. And actually, your point previously, I mean, $20 million from the Canadian government is really a drop in the bucket. That's
there's
really
been some
not
federal
much.
and some small provincial. Yeah. Just honestly, probably just to like glue the parts together, right? You gotta get the tab A into slot B.
Exactly. The C-pillar. I know things about cars. But yeah, I think that the conversation, it's an interesting juxtaposition because it does actually force you to think, well, hold on a second, does this actually make sense? Because I think two things. One is you always question, I've at least always questioned the cleanliness of creating the batteries, which is a dirty business. So getting the minerals, putting them together in a way that's, not the worst. And then, of course, we all know that you can't throw your AA batteries out in the garbage because it's toxic. You can't put that in the dump. So those batteries are bigger and they don't decompose as easily either. So I don't know the process of recycling a battery or creating a battery, but it's not clean.
It's interesting that you're going right to the mineral stuff, and I'm just thinking about dirty energy going into the grid to charge the batteries. Or even, I think as Paris talks about, just this idea that we can take new 21st century technology, put it on top of the 20th century infrastructure, and then somehow, just because they're iPhone cars, that will solve not only the emission problem, but the traffic death problem, traffic congestion, all the conversations that we're having about 5-minute cities, like everything else.
And they were pointing out that it's not new, right? Like electric cars, that's how automobiles started. Not again, through internal combustion.
Back to Tesla. It all comes back to Tesla. Okay, so this is really interesting. This is a bit of a new format for us where we're stitching together 2 interviews for a cumulative impact. We're also kind of like teasing out the implications of these interviews before you, dear listener, happen to listen to them. But hey, we deliver the goods right up front, right? You can listen to the rest of this on 1.25 speed. It'll be totally fine. Anything else about this conversation, or maybe something that you learned as part of these conversations that we might look to carry forward into future episodes?
I just think that the meta point that Paris is making about, hold on a second, you got to think about it, because it was a physical thing and not a software thing. My brain didn't go into, hold on, does this make sense? So the juxtaposition of those two things, I'd be interested to hear what our audience thinks about whether the twain shall meet. Can they meet? How do you reconcile those differences?
I think what you're leading to is what I'm thinking too. One, the more I learned about Project Arrow, the cooler I thought it was. Like the fact that they've literally made a car that if someone wanted to, they could manufacture right now. This isn't a concept thing. Like this thing runs, people could be driving it. That's pretty friggin' cool. As part of a local initiative. And then the second thing is like
a lot of that shit's smoke and mirrors, right? Like normally it's smoke and mirrors.
Yes, a lot of it is normally smoke and mirrors.
Concept cars never actually show up.
No, this is not a concept car. This is by definition a prototype.
It's a white labeled thing.
I think that reinforces our traditional interests in these spaces where it comes to extractive natural resources, auto manufacturing talent, the classic Doug Ford Friends kind of approach to industry, society, and economy. And then you have someone like Paris that I find very compelling, being like, well, maybe we have to consider these other things, which are 3-dimensional and very complex and hard to visualize. It kind of seems like Project Arrow right at that moment is zooming by like Mark McGuire on The Simpsons, being like, you want to see me hit some dingers? Pay no attention to this. Watch me hit some dingers. We can build our own cars. And I think the reason why I'm so happy with us, dabbling into new formats here is because this is a complex conversation. We want to bring that to our audience and honestly have you all direct where we take this next and who we might have on next. We made a very conscious decision to not have this be a panel-based show because we didn't think it was necessarily fair to either Flavio or Paris to kind of engage with each other because they're speaking on very different terms. I don't think that would have been informative, but you are going to hear them one after the other. So let's get started with Flavio Volpe, president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association.
Flavio, thank you so much for coming on the show. First of all, tell us who you are.
I'm Flavio Volpe. I'm the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. This is a trade association for the original equipment automotive suppliers. That's hard and soft and tools to new car manufacturing in Canada.
or APMA. It's much more fun to say APMA. But tell us the elevator pitch of the Aero, please.
We don't have a domestic automaker in Canada. And in spite of that, we're the 10th largest jurisdiction for auto manufacturing in the world. And so we thought, what can we do to tell the story of the hundreds of parts suppliers whose parts and systems go nameless into everything from Fords to Ferraris here in Canada, and use a new platform to be able to tell people around the world that if you're going to electrify, if you're going to make connected autonomous vehicles, we've got everything from bumper to bumper in Canada. So we said, why don't we design our own car? Why don't we build our own car? Why don't we try to make it 100% Canadian and then show the world? And at CES in Las Vegas, we unveiled a rolling prototype. We called it Project Aero, and we've been inundated since with requests and love letters and challenges, and I think it worked. And everything from AI applications in autonomous drive to magnesium structural components. I'm getting incoming calls from car makers around the world who say, bring the car to us, bring the suppliers to us, or by the way, I need somebody in the subframe business, or I need to understand who you have in a human machine interface. And so we're making those connections from inbound calls. It's really never happened that way.
That's really interesting. It's funny because I think what happened to BlackBerry, if you remember, they effectively, once they bought QNX, they basically became the car operating system, or at least they positioned themselves as that's really where BlackBerry has ended up from a software perspective. But that's software, that's not all the physical parts. How much of this is, look, we can do this, and a proof of concept just to generate that kind of interest? And how much of this is truly, we really want to make this car?
Well, we really want to make this one car.
Yes.
So we raised $20 million to do it. And a lot of the conversation was initially a bit confused. Okay, well, so you've launched a car company, and where can I buy an Aero? I said, I haven't launched a car company. I've launched the idea in your head that if you're going to launch a car company, I have the kit for you. 100% of the kit can come from Canada. And if what you need is, or you're in the car business, but you need really advanced cybersecurity options, well, I've got 7 here on this car. And so we've been able to turn those conversations around. That first set of conversations, can I buy one, is general public, interested people. That second set of conversations is really important with the 20 or so automakers that make cars in the region or sell cars in the region. They've all got a different framing for, I think, what we're capable of here. Sometimes you go and buy throttle bodies from somebody.
Right.
And you know that supplier in London, Ontario is great on throttle bodies. But when you're launching a new model and you're open bidding to everybody, what I'm hoping to do here is, and we're bringing this car to specific car makers and say, when you launch a new model and you're a new program and you're going for bidding on it, come to me and I'll give you 230 options. And then do your due diligence, of course. But you don't have to come to me for one thing now. We can give you options on all of them.
How much custom engineering had to be done for the parts that we do make, aside from the screen? Or is this just like run of course for all the Canadian parts manufacturers, just like another body, another shape?
No, these are all brand new designs on all the components, except for perhaps the powertrain. When we said to the companies, when we launched this project, I thought we were going to get 150 to 200 companies interested. Well, 534 bid on it. And we said, okay, you need to be commercially ready and scalable for the 2025 model year. So that due diligence brought it down to 230, and then ultimately we chose 58 of them. With all those companies, we said, don't give me unobtainium. If I'm going to show this to Volkswagen, and they like that magnesium B-pillar, the design brief here was, imagine this as a vehicle that gets made at a volume of 50,000 units a year,
right,
at $60,000 Canadian.
So you intend to, going back to the previous thread, are you intending on producing this car as a viable thing for consumers, or more of a like, look, we can make it, we really aren't going to produce this in a mass way? You know how like a lot of car manufacturers like, here, look at this crazy thing, it's got lasers and arrows, and I mean those things are usually, I mean, unless it's like BMW, they're things you don't really ever buy. Is that the idea when it comes, if it comes to market? Like whether it comes to market or not seems irrelevant, but
yeah, this is my favorite question, Rob, because we were so successful, I think, at doing this that people don't really understand that, you know, hey, by the way, we're a trade association. I got 14 people here. We do lobbying and advocacy.
Yeah.
And we were able to assemble all of these companies and their skunkworks team. So there was really about 400 or 500 people who worked on this thing here. but it's not for manufacture. But what we've said to people, it's a kit. So if you said that you wanted to launch a car company in Canada, we just did all the homework for you. Right. Now, what you need to do is you need to find mobile capital that is willing to risk.
You need Elon Musk type
automotive ROIs.
Yeah. Like to be like, you just, you give me some pre-orders and maybe I'll cancel them. And in 10 years, I'll give you a gigantic amount. Okay. Yeah.
But we didn't build a concept car. It's not automakers might do a clay model to show what's possible.
Right.
Or a concept car non-rolling. We did it as a full working prototype so that you could do the whole thing if you wanted to. And I made a bold prediction. I said, we brought this to the Toronto Auto Show, the Canadian International Auto Show. And it was the feature car at the show, the first time a non-car maker's car was a feature.
That's crazy.
And I said, you know what? In 10 years, you're going to be able to buy Canadian cars. They'll be demonstrated here at the auto show because we've just showed everybody that we have everything you need to do it, including the people and the technology and the companies. And so you just got to figure out the capital part.
I mean, this particular point in the universe for finding capital is kind of wacky. But Canada, over the last 10, 15 years, we are fundamentally have been an extractive economy, right? Producing, like taking from the ground, producing parts, producing energy. And over the last maybe 10, 15 years, while tech was cool, we were pushing an innovation-based economy. So our brains and not the things we stand on. You've highlighted hey, look, we do have stuff. So not only do we have the minerals potentially to produce components of an electric car, but we can actually make the whole car. Not that we couldn't before, but you've shown that, there is still arm and muscle in Canada in our ability to build stuff.
Yeah, we felt that doing that, if we could show people that we could make the whole thing, then we can use it as a Trojan horse to sell all the tech that's inside it.
Yeah.
We're leaders in AI. We're leaders in machine learning. Like you said, talked about BlackBerry. Everybody talks about BlackBerry and the rise and fall of BlackBerry. For us in the auto business, QNX is extraordinary. It is the platform on half of the cars in the world. And so showing everybody a sleek new design, I went and recruited the chief engineer for special projects, Aston Martin, to be our chief engineer, kind of opened a bunch of people's eyes to, this is a real exercise. And when they show up to look at the car, to play with the devices that are on it, they realize, oh my God, this is a level 3 autonomous vehicle that has 7 layers of cybersecurity and a 500 kilometer range that was engineered in a way that took the whole envelope of the vehicle in mind.
On the previous episodes of this show, we've had, for example, a company called Canadian Shield that pivoted to build PPE when we needed it. And then what happened was when it became not as urgent, the government went back to procuring stuff from China. So we've kind of shot ourselves in the foot in terms of built at home, being self-sufficient as an economy. Do you think that this kind of puts a period at the end of the sentence of we need to continue as a country to invest in being able to build our own shit? And has that pushed that conversation at all, or are you nervous about it?
No, not nervous about it at all. I think we're at the front of it. The Canadian Shield story is a great one. It's a microcosm of what we did here at the beginning of the pandemic, March 16th, 2020. I made a call. On the government side, we said, look, what do you need? And give me the specs and give me the volumes. We'll see if we can do it. We've got 1,400 factories. And we led the call. 165 parts makers put their hands up. Within a month, we were making PPE. Within 6 weeks, we were making ventilators. And one of those great companies was Canadian Shield. And what we did then, which was right after we had launched this program, this is a 3-year program, I think we restored the idea that there's a dignity of making things and how important it is that when you need something, it's usually something. When you go to war or there's a pandemic, you need something between you and the worst possible outcome. And so Canadian Shield was a great story because, of course, they went from software into stepping up. I mean, the leadership there was incredible, stepping up for what the country needed. And I think that by doing that whole pivot, and I think that was the greatest peacetime mobilization of the Canadian industrial capacity ever. We've seen over the last 18 months, the province and the federal government here have partnered on the greatest run of automotive investment in the history of the automotive sector here. $17 billion and counting from 5 different manufacturers here. And they just landed last week, Volkswagen, a 6th manufacturer. In part, Aero, we opened everybody's eyes to, hey, by the way, both the federal and provincial government, if you compete with other jurisdictions, to go and land these major EV mandates and battery mandates. You know we can deliver because you saw it firsthand, and you know how quickly we can pivot. You saw it firsthand. And by the way, we met and exceeded global specs on stuff that you thought was crazy. People when I said we're going to make ventilators,
Yeah.
I remember there was a CBC interview, and somebody interviewed a professor from the University of Windsor and said, that guy's crazy. So it made Project Aero less of a crazy premise. And we did convince both the province of Quebec and Ontario and the federal government to join us on this ride.
That's crazy. It just took a pandemic for us to realize that we've got what we need.
Sure.
Maybe projecting out into the future here, thinking about what a future looks like. What's hip and cool these days is electric vehicles. Everyone's making an electric vehicle, but we're still sort of like centralizing our infrastructure around cars. Like we're not investing heavily in public transportation. So, if we're going to mess with, say, electric vehicles, we're going to need infrastructure for that, right? We're going to need charging stations more than we have right now. When you think about the build of this car and the parts and what we can actually do, are you thinking about the design of like what comes next? Not just like iterating on the car, but like what the infrastructure could look like, how the parts manufacturers can play a role in the Canadian infrastructure around either electric cars or other forms of transportation? Or is this just like block and tackle? Let's just prove we can do this first, and then we'll see what comes next.
No, I think you've hit on what we wanted to do with a project like this. We said we're going to bring a whole bunch of eyes, but we want to start conversations that are relevant about the whole ecosystem. And what we've done with this one here is we talked about, look, we can do the electrification piece. We could have made this a fuel cell piece. What's going to choke the deployment of this is, do we have a holistic approach to the ecosystem? We talk about the federal government says we're going to target of 100% new vehicles by 2035 to be zero emissions. Well, what happens when 35% of us live in multifamily residences? Are we going to run extension cords from the...
I have street parking. I live in Toronto.
Right?
I can't...
Right.
I'd love an electric car, but I can't.
So we've been able to start and get involved in a lot of those conversations. Induction charging, intelligent infrastructure. How do you connect to intelligent infrastructure without a software bill of materials? You need this stuff. And so this is a jumping off point. Aero for us is just the natural next step. We've done demonstration projects before. This is the first one that was a whole new car build. But we do annual design competitions. Last year we did one for accessibility. How do we take all this technology and then have people who have disabilities that keep them out of driver's license, or can extend their driving experience, or can be used differently than we're talking about zero collisions versus just zero emissions. Stay tuned. We want to be at the center of that conversation because we think a lot of the technology is deployable, but we need to ask the hard questions that bring people to the table.
The BetaKit podcast is sponsored by Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt LLP. Osler is the leading business law firm for startups, high-growth companies, and investors in Canada, and for the second year, the firm has released the Deal Points Report, Venture Capital Financings, a study of 353 anonymized Canadian venture capital and growth equity financings. This report looks at deals from 2020 to 2022, valued at more than $6 billion USD, and provides data and insights for founders, entrepreneurs, investors, and advisors contemplating transactions. The report draws on publicly available data on venture capital and growth equity financings, as well as Osler's confidential, anonymized data sources. You can read the Deal Points Report, Venture Capital Financings at osler.com, and let them know that BetaKit sent you. All right. As we noted, Flavio, audio quality aside a little bit, is very gung-ho about Project Aero, and we're going to keep tabs on it in the future. But now, we want to give you the second half of this conversation, the one that I had with Paris Marx, Canadian tech critic, about why big tech keeps getting the future of transportation wrong. Explain to me, Paris, what exactly is the Valley's pitch on the future of transportation? What is the vision that they're laying out that they want all of us to buy into?
Yeah, so the big pitch that they were making, and this has probably changed a little bit now as a number of these things have really kind of failed and gone off a cliff, was that there are all these problems in our transport system, right? Whether it's the emissions that are caused by all of our cars, whether it's the deaths that happen on the road, or, all the time that we spend stuck in traffic, right? And their kind of argument was, we know all these things are happening. We know that they're problems and that people recognize. So we are going to solve them by introducing these new technologies into the transport system, whether it's ride-hailing services or self-driving cars or flying cars or boring company tunnels. These are some of the bigger ones, the more prominent ones that we've heard about. And of course, I would put electric cars into that mix as well, though I would say, it's not a failure so much as the other ones. I think it's just, maybe the framing of it isn't as accurate or true as we would hope or want to see. But so this is the big pitch, right? There are all these problems in the transport system. We are going to invent these new technologies that will solve it. So we don't need to have difficult conversation around politics or how we're thinking more broadly about the transport system or whether our dependence on cars overall is a problem. Rather, we're just going to make these technologies. These technologies will allow us to magically fix the problem, and then it'll all go away and we don't need to worry about this anymore because the tech industry has fixed it for us. Thanks, tech industry.
Okay, so generally, let's fix the problems created by 20th century technology with 21st century technology. We're just going to add a new modern tech stack on top of the automobile, and that will provide specific enhancements. What about that pitch, that vision, do you feel is wrong or not preferable to the common good? Or even you had noted off the top that the pitch had kind of changed a little bit.
Sure. Well, I would say most parts of the pitch, right?
Okay.
If you think about Uber, for example, that really comes along. I think it's 2008 or 2009 when that company is founded. And then, obviously it takes a few years to get going because at first it's basically a black car service. And then it's once Lyft launches its kind of alternative that is more kind of focused on taking on the taxi industry, that Uber expands in that direction as well with UberX, right? And so, the idea of what Uber is actually going to be isn't like, we are going to replace drivers with autonomous vehicles until like 2014, right? That only comes along later. The initial thing is, we are going to make it much easier for you to get a cab and much cheaper for you to get a cab. And the experience is going to be so much better for the drivers, and in the process, we're going to cut traffic congestion and all this kind of stuff. And of course, there was a bigger vision built there around, if you listen to Travis Kalanick, one of the co-founders of the company, was basically like, we are going to move away from this environment of personal ownership of the automobile toward, a shared automobile future where we're all just kind of hailing these rides and this is how we get around now, right? And I would say that was always a bit of a pipe dream, but it was something that a lot of people bought into for a while. It emerged at a period when the economy is really in the tank and governments and the public and the media are looking for like, how are we going to create jobs and prosperity and things like this into the future? How are we going to come out of this hole? And the tech industry really positions itself as, the way that we're going to do this, right? The way that we're going to create a ton of jobs and all this kind of stuff. And Uber benefits from that moment by not having the amount of scrutiny that it probably deserved as it was pushing its model as the future of employment and things like that on top of the future of transportation.
I'm wondering, when you are speaking about Silicon Valley's pitch about the future of transportation, about where transportation is headed, particularly the history of transportation and how that's changed with technological eras, which I don't know if we're going to get into, but is very, very interesting. How you view current EV promises separate from this, and how much are they intertwined with the autonomous stuff or anything else? Can we just have cool EV cars that don't consume dead dinosaur bones? Or are auto manufacturers, technology companies interweaving all of this stuff part and parcel?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question, right? And EVs are not a new technology, right? They're from the 1800s. I do think it's interesting, and I like the way that you framed it, because I do feel like because of Tesla in particular, that autonomy and electric vehicles and these sorts of concepts have been tied up with one another. And it's really not essential that they are one and the same, right? Like when we think about the electric vehicles that are being introduced in North America right now, if you think of like the Tesla model of what's the electric vehicle, right? It's kind of a sports car or like a higher priced kind of vehicle, more on the luxury end of the spectrum than more of a regular kind of commuter car, likely we would have seen it the Toyota Prius as being, or the Nissan Leaf or something like that, right? Just kind of your regular standard vehicle. Rather, the idea of what the electric vehicle is, because of the model that Tesla has set for us and kind of put in a lot of people's minds, is this more luxury vehicle, is slightly more expensive, is filled with a bunch of these technologies, and that has become the expectation as a lot of the other automakers have moved into this sector. And so now what we see is a lot of vehicles that are being introduced by other companies that have been electrified are like these really massive trucks that, of course, have a lot of new tech features in them, really huge SUVs, which is not just a Tesla thing, but is part of how the auto industry in North America has been moving progressively over the course of a couple decades now, that makes the electric vehicle kind of less attainable as a solution, because the focus has been putting really massive batteries in them and filling them with all these technologies, assisted driving features and all these sorts of things, the sort of features that you'd expect from maybe more of like a Lexus or a Lincoln than a Ford or a Chevrolet vehicle if we were thinking internal combustion vehicles. So that becomes the expectation. So they're more expensive, so they're more difficult to attain. And I was talking to Edward Niedermeyer recently, who wrote a book called Ludicrous, The Unvarnished History of Tesla Motors. And he basically explains that Tesla kind of created this premium car market that is more focused around the kind of Silicon Valley tech worker market, right? It recognized that there was a market in tech workers to promote a vehicle that was more aligned with kind of their values or their kind of self-perceptions. And then that model of that market has influenced a lot of what the other car makers have done in introducing these models. The vehicle that, of course, a lot of Silicon Valley people drove before driving a Tesla was a Toyota Prius. And so there was a real change there in kind of the thinking of what type of vehicle should define kind of what a green, sustainable vehicle looks like.
What's the iPhone of sustainable vehicles? 100%.
Absolutely.
I guess how much do you buy the counter argument there that automobile manufacturers would say is, for a couple of reasons, we start introducing these technologies at the high end because, one, they're more expensive. Two, we feel that if we can produce these for our luxury vehicles, which there's a strong sense of desire to attain, figure out the production of that those technologies will soon disseminate to all of our lines. And then in 5 years, in 10 years, the standard vehicle that rolls off the floor for anyone will have this net new technology. In the much same way we have air conditioning and powered windows and all of those things. Like, do you feel that this is pure marketing? Because vehicle purchasing is a very psychological consideration in just our society. Or would you agree that there are some logistical manufacturing considerations that are moving people to, look at the S model of this brand or whatever versus us just having a standard electric vehicle that anyone could buy for like $20,000 or something like that, or $15,000?
I would say if you look at the general trend of the auto market, you can kind of see what the incentives are and what the auto companies are trying to do, right? For the past few decades, there's been an ongoing push to move people away from more basic sedans toward SUVs, large trucks, crossovers even, right? And these vehicles create more profit for the auto companies. They're more expensive, but the margins are higher on these vehicles. And so I think what you're seeing with the electric vehicle market is that they're trying to build in the expectation of higher prices for these vehicles so that they can make more profit off of them. If you're thinking about what is actually necessary, to make these vehicles, to bring down costs, what you need is scale, right? In order to get the kind of scale economies of this. And so if you're only making vehicles that appeal to a higher end market, then you're not necessarily going to get the scale that you need in order to deliver that than if you're making a more kind of mass market vehicle. And I think it's also interesting to look at the differences in the electric vehicle markets in different countries, right? Because North America is a bit distinct in this matter, in that our electric vehicle market is really focused on the high end, right? It's more of a premium vehicle market. Whereas if you look at China or parts of Asia, the electric vehicle market is much more of like a basic market that is focused on the average consumer or driver, or whatever term you want to use there, where the vehicles themselves are much less expensive. They're just not the expectation that they're going to be filled with all these technologies and, assisted driving systems and things like that. They're made to be affordable to people. The range isn't always as long, but that means that there's also fewer minerals that are necessary to put into these batteries. And as long as you have the charging network that's necessary, that's not going to be a problem. And Europe is sort of in the middle there, right? There's certainly Teslas and things like that in their market as well, but there's also more of a attainable, I guess, electric vehicle market there too. And so I think it's been kind of a distinct decision to focus on that upper market in North America, because there's a lot more profit by going in that direction and setting an expectation that this is how we're going to approach it. And I think that just on your broader point there around like what's sustainable then, like what is actually going to deliver the environmental benefit that we're expecting from this transition, if we're all driving electric vehicles, but they're massive SUVs and trucks with huge batteries that gives you however many 100 kilometers of range, that have required a lot more mining in order to create those batteries. And a lot of the life cycle emissions of these electric vehicles come from the production of the battery and how large that is actually going to be, then I think that's kind of setting us back on the environmental benefits that we're actually hoping to achieve from this transition by not having a conversation about how these things are going early on.
Okay. I want to maybe transition to that broader conversation about like, okay, what should we be doing and what needs to be done? But first, I just want to, you had mentioned how different markets are approaching this different. I'm wondering if you just have any take on what was recently revealed at this year's CES, Consumer Electronics Showcase, named Project Arrow. It's received funding from both the federal and the provincial government. And I'm just wondering, maybe we can use that as a bit of sense of how you feel about these Canadian-made offerings, how our government seems to be looking to subsidize that development, and maybe we'll take that into the conversation about how we should be approaching transportation more broadly. Or is Project Arrow on your radar at all?
I've definitely heard about it. I haven't paid close attention to Project Arrow. I don't really have any kind of opposition to it or anything like that. I do think it's interesting to see that the federal and provincial governments are putting money into it. Not wholly surprised. The governments do like to take bets on things like this. And especially in this moment, they've been putting a lot of money into electric vehicle production, into battery production, trying to make it easier to mine these kinds of minerals that will be necessary for the batteries. So yeah, it's not a surprise to see them investing in these things. And I think my biggest concern is, when we look at the federal and provincial governments, there is a lot of focus on electric vehicles as being the solution to reducing emissions in transportation, right? And they're very focused on this. And my concern is that we're putting a bit too much focus on this and kind of overestimating the potential impact of electrifying all of our vehicles, especially as we were talking about, if we don't have this conversation about the types of vehicles that are actually coming out on the other end of that process, and not putting more effort into, investing in alternatives that I know we're going to talk about.
Yeah. Okay. So then let's just transition directly to the alternatives. What if you were the world's transportation czar, or maybe just for North America? Let's gate it a little bit. How would you prefer we be approaching modernizing our transportation infrastructure and utilizing new technology, but then also maybe aligning that to particular social interests separate from the capitalist ones? Because this is a huge economic driver in North America, vehicle production, but it's also a pretty significant component of our carbon footprint. It's not our biggest, but it's definitely, it drives so many conversations about the society that we live in and what we like and what we don't like and what we might be stuck with. So how, if you had a bit of a blank checkbook or even the current checkbooks, how would you be looking to push North America towards an alternative?
Yeah. And so just to be clear, transport emissions are the number one source of emissions in the United States. They're number two in Canada, second to oil and gas. And of course, we know a lot of oil and gas is burned in transportation. So, it does have a really significant impact on the emissions that we put out there. And I would also say, you know, we started off by talking about how people recognize that there are a lot of problems in the transportation system today that go far beyond the emissions that come out of the tailpipes of our vehicles, right? That there's issues with traffic congestion, there's issues with road deaths, there's issues with the amount of money that we pay just to own cars and drive around and fill them up and all these sorts of things, right?
Sprawl and density because everyone's driving. Yes, 100%.
Absolutely. All of these issues and all that sprawl and density, of course, makes it more expensive for governments to deliver services to us as well because you have lower population densities and stuff, right? So there's a whole load of things that go into this. And these are really the products of decisions that we've made over many decades or a century, right? And so completely kind of upending the transport network or how we build our communities is not something that's going to happen overnight. And I do think that we all need to recognize that. And that's why I still think that electric vehicles, as much as I don't think they're a silver bullet, are still a really important part of that solution. And they're still something that we need to be focused on promoting. But what I would like to see is the governments also focus much more on alternatives that make it possible for people to drive less or just own fewer cars, right? In the way that an Uber would have promoted a decade ago. But I would say that I don't think you actually get that by making an Uber service. I think that the way that you get that is by investing more in public transit, by investing more in cycling infrastructures, by ensuring that when we're building new housing and new communities, that we're building them in such a way that people can walk or cycle to get to where they need to go, rather than always having to drive, because a lot of our communities now are built such that you basically have to drive to get anywhere. And, you know, the big shopping centers are over here and all the houses are in a different part of the city. And so you need to drive, right? And I think that's a fundamental mistake. And so we need to start trying to repair those things, not something that's going to happen overnight. But governments can still spend a lot to improve the transit services that exist in our communities, to make it easier for people to cycle by ensuring that the cycle lanes are there, by ensuring that there's safe parking areas so that if you need to leave your bike somewhere, you can put it there and know that it's not going to get stolen. These are really important things, right? Even just ensuring that sidewalks are being cleared properly in the winter so that people can depend on being able to walk somewhere.
Yes.
Yeah. You know, these seem like basic things, but in many cases, like, they're not properly funded. They're not given the resources that they deserve so that these things can work effectively. And so I would say, like, if we're thinking about transit in particular, that means, you know, investing in a better bus network that is more extensive and more reliable. It means giving lanes to buses so that they're not always being stuck in traffic. Obviously, you have the streetcar network in Toronto, which is great. Not a lot of cities have something like that. Improvements to subway systems in our bigger cities, which obviously have been kind of on hold in places like Toronto and Montreal for a while. Much bigger expansions are needed in order to serve their populations, and that hasn't been done. But I would also say we need the links between communities as well, right? For many decades now, there's been a policy of kind of letting the rail network just kind of starve because the rails were privatized in the 90s by the Chrétien government. And so now all the passenger rails are second to freight trains. And so even just starting to improve that by investing in like high-speed rail on the Windsor to Quebec City corridor, where over half of the Canadian population is. Like, these seem like really basic things that should just be obvious if you're really focused on reducing transport emissions and thinking how we live more sustainably in the future. And it's disappointing to see governments not doing more to move in that direction.
Yeah. Okay. You had noted something interesting here. I guess my initial question was going to be, do you feel like this has to be public works, government driven, or do private companies play a role? It's worth noting that most of the transportation that used to be under government purview, whether at municipal, provincial, kind of federal level, has in some ways been privatized. What would your ideal balance be between those interests? Because I think there's a lot of people that would look like our governments can't handle anything right now. Part of the reason why Toronto hasn't had transportation progress is because they can't, like, they're still working on a proposal from the 60s. Like, they're still just trying to implement that. There's a level of efficacy required to deliver this. What would your kind of working relationship be to drive that? And I guess, how confident are you in the likelihood of these changes happening?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I am a bit pessimistic, but I would also say that if there's nobody pushing for it, it will never happen, right? And so I hope that at least by having some of these conversations, it does encourage people to maybe push political leaders a bit more to try to make these things happen. You know, there are more and more organizations forming in cities around the country that are pushing for more investment in transit and you know, communities and things like that. And I think that's a really important step. On your point about who should handle it, I do think it's important to recognize how governments have failed us in letting these things deteriorate and not making the investments that should have been made. And I would say that I think that there's a bit of a cycle here, right? Like when the government sells things off and gets rid of those capacities, then it makes it more difficult for them to deliver on them in the future. And so I would say the way that we're going to achieve these things is by rebuilding that capacity in the public sector that we've lost through successive privatizations and things over the course of many decades. And that won't happen overnight. And so maybe there are times when the government does need to work with the private sector to make something happen. For too long, we've allowed ourselves to be kind of distracted by the ideas that the tech industry has put out there without giving them the proper scrutiny that they deserve, right? To ensure that we're actually going to get the public benefits that they promise us. And I think that transportation is somewhere where that comes through very clearly. You know, if we look at the promises that were made about autonomous vehicles in the 2010s. If we look at the promises that were made about Uber and ride-hailing services and how they were going to make our cities so much more efficient and all these sorts of things, time and time again, these companies are not able to deliver on their promises, or at least not fully able to. And usually there are a lot of consequences that come of them as well that were not kind of predicted in the early stages when all the benefits were being promoted, right? And so I do think it's important that we have a more critical relationship to the tech industry and to the technologies that it's promoting, or new business ideas, or whatever you want to call them. It's not always wholly innovations. It's different ways of applying technologies that will allow them to profit in more ways. But I just think having that more critical relationship is better for ensuring that we actually get the benefits that are being promised, and that we can say much earlier on, there's a problem with this idea that whatever company is putting out there, maybe we should hold off on allowing this to be integrated into our transport system or whatever it is until we are able to do more research on it, until we're able to get a proper regulatory framework in place. But I do think we need to get more comfortable with that if we want to ensure a better relationship between the public and, you know, everything that's going on and the technologies that are being implemented or pushed at us, and that we're expected to just absorb and accept without thinking about what they're actually going to mean for the broader society.
All right, listeners, you've heard the two conversations that we've had as we try to start to map out a very complex conversation about EV, clean tech, the future of transportation, how that relates to Canadian tech innovation, or more broadly, tech from a Canadian perspective. If you want to see us continue this conversation, got to let us know. If you have people you think we should speak to, you got to let us know. You can do that simply by dropping us a line at podcast@betakit.com. I think we might get a few EV-related questions in our next AMA. So if you've got a question for us on that, not a comment or a comment, podcast@betakit.com. The BetaKit podcast is produced by BetaKit Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.